Under other circumstances, I would have called it a prank, or a bureaucratic mistake, or maybe even the delusion of a man who had finally stayed off the grid too long. But this wasn't a misdelivery. I knew that before I even unsealed the outer casing. The package was waiting on the steps of my cabin that morning. No postal labels, no courier mark, no return address, no signature of receipt. Just a plain, olive-colored container, with a handle wrapped in cracked synthetic rubber, stamped faintly with the shadow of a once bright military emblem that time and sun had almost erased. The only visible marking was a hand-etched code, scratched shallowly into the lid, RZ117, GHATT, KL Rowe. I froze the moment I saw it. No one had called me KL Rowe since I left the program in 2009. That name hadn't appeared on a single tax record, credit document, or communications log in 15 years, not since I buried it. I didn't even think my daughter knew what the initials stood for. I carried the box inside, carefully, like a device that could still explode if the charge hadn't degraded. My cabin sat 10 miles from the nearest road, down in a dry Colorado basin where signal didn't reach and the land forgot names. That was the point. Off-grid, off-books, off-mind. I hadn't seen another person face to face in over 2 years. I lived alone, ate from cans and soil, worked a patch of solar, and only powered up my signal decoder twice a month to download weather and orbital drift data from the public satellites. My last contact with any former agency, TIE, had been a warning email in 2014, sent from a shuttered domain. Do not engage, do not respond. Burn after reading. I did. But the memory of it stayed where the flame couldn't reach. The container wasn't locked, just sealed with a melted strip of synthetic resin that cracked as I applied heat. Inside was something heavier than expected, a rectangular black box, about the size of a shoebox, matte finish with a slight, grain-like aircraft fuselage skin. It had no branding, no port markings, just one recessed input on the bottom, proprietary and unfamiliar. I knew enough from my time in advanced reconnaissance systems to recognize what I was looking at. It was a data core, and an old one at that, not civilian, not even standard military. This was deep archive tech-redundant memory architecture, vibration-stabilized for mobile logging, built for missions that were expected to go wrong. What made my stomach clench wasn't the box itself. It was the handwritten label taped underneath. Flight SO9 Delta, unreg. Retrieval, do not integrate to mainframe. 4 eyes only, KL Rowe. That flight number didn't match any NASA, ESA, or private payload log I had access to during my time in clearance. And the term unreg, retrieval unregistered, was Black Label terminology. Things you went in for, but were never supposed to bring back. I sat with it for hours before even thinking about powering it up. The input was alien to my current equipment. But after some digging in old crates and a few makeshift splices, I found a conversion relay from a defunct telemetry deck I had kept for scrap. I rigged up an isolated power loop, routed the signal to an offline monitor, and fed the box 12 volts of clean current. At first nothing. Just dead silence and a faint hum of internal stabilization. But at the 33-second mark, the screen flickered. White noise. Then a spectral interface bled onto the screen, green lines over black, as if the box hadn't realized it was still alive and had to wake itself from cold storage. A command prompt blinked once, initiate. I hovered my finger over the enter key, feeling sweat pool down my neck. Every instinct I had from my former life told me not to touch it. But I did. The screen jumped into motion. Not a boot sequence, something else. Audio waveforms irregular, distorted, but rhythmically pulsing like a human voice, trying to speak through layers of interference. A transcription protocol initialized on its own, overlaying corrupted spectrograms with partial reconstructions. Fragments of words began to appear. Some in English, some in codes, some in phonetic bursts I didn't recognize at all. OZFWD, primary lost at 02 to 9. No sky, only metal. My breath caught in my chest when a name appeared, Capt. Jeremy Havar, EchoCom 6. Havar was listed KIA in 2006. I remember the debrief silent protocol. Complete deniability, declared atmospheric failure over hostile terrain. But the voice, ... The voice I was hearing in those fragments, it was his. Trembling, coughing, alive. Then came the part that made me stagger backward. The system generated a text tag, mid-feed. A folder structure unrolled like a memory map, labeled Session RZ117GH, followed by Personnel ID, KL. Row authenticated. It knew who I was. Not guest authenticated. There was no signal uplink, no connection to any net. The data box had confirmed me through proximity. Through some old biometric echo, or embedded protocol, I didn't even remember authorizing. The black box had waited, and it had been sent specifically, solely, to me. My hands were shaking now. I couldn't tell if it was the residual charge from the power interface, or something deeper. Like my nervous system recognizing an old frequency it hadn't tuned into in decades. As the logs kept unraveling, I saw something worse than static. Motion capture files with no frame references. Camera angles that drifted, as if shot by something hovering without intention. One file was labeled portal_sigma_frame, another simply red regret, Nultiga. And the last file in the chain, the one it wouldn't let me open yet, had a title that cut through everything. Return_not_permitted. I sat in the cabin's darkness for a long time after that, the only light coming from the pulsing monitor and the slow, rhythmic blink of the box's heartbeat led. Outside, the wind scraped the side of the structure like claws, trying to remember how to knock. I hadn't slept in 30 hours. I hadn't made coffee. I hadn't even eaten. But I was fully awake now. This wasn't a debrief. This wasn't a leftover fragment from an op I'd forgotten. This was a summons. From a mission that didn't exist. From voices that were never supposed to speak again. And I had already answered. I hadn't moved the black box from the center of the table. It remained there like a thing still breathing. Like a heart amputated from a larger body but stubbornly refusing to die. I tried turning off the screen twice. It kept powering itself back up, even without external voltage. The heartbeat lead blinked with a stubborn pulse of soft red, slow and steady, the exact rhythm of a human resting pulse. 58 beats per minute, I counted. It felt deliberate, like something had calibrated it to mimic the biological, to comfort or to mock. The air in the cabin was different now, thicker, drier. Or maybe it was just the tension inside me, compacting the molecules around my ribs. Outside, the wind had stopped. The stillness wasn't peace. It was prelude. That night, or what I believed was still night, I set up an old sound isolation rig from my former work in acoustic recon. I wasn't trying to record the box, I was trying to understand the subtle tremors it emitted when not actively transmitting. I placed the contact mic along its edge, patted the table to prevent structural reverberations, and ran the signal through a filtration deck I hadn't touched since 2011. At first, the lines were flat, background hum. Then, faintly, a vibration not audible to the ear, but present in the subsurface frequency range. I adjusted the gain and isolated the band. It wasn't just noise, it was pattern, rhythmic, not musical, not mechanical. Language. I stared at the waveform for a long time, watching the shape of the pulses, the way they formed peaks and valleys. Like speech trapped in metal, slowed down to an inhuman crawl. I ran it through linguistic deconstruction software, the kind we used for deep-field intercept scrambled transmissions, pulsar echoes, encrypted signals riding carrier waves. The result came back with a 23% match on English phonetics, but more disturbingly, a 17% match on my own voice. That couldn't be right. I hadn't spoken near the box. I hadn't recorded anything. But the spectral pattern showed inflection peaks that aligned with my past voice print, the same one I had logged in classified systems before retiring. The metadata timestamp on the file was dated 6 months from now. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even pretend to try. I sat in the chair with the box in front of me, waiting for it to do something else, anything. But it didn't. It simply pulsed. Like a patient. Like a captive. As the minutes passed, I began to feel an old itch behind the eyes. Something I hadn't experienced since Operation Carapace, in the Arctic Circle, the sensation that someone was behind me. Just out of my peripheral, never moving, but present, not watching. Listening. At 3:16 a.m., the box emitted a sound that bypassed the audio rig entirely. It vibrated the wood beneath it, resonated in the screws, in the wall joints, in the bone. Not a tone, not a beep. A low-frequency growl that lasted exactly 1.1 seconds, as if something inside had turned over in its sleep. I backed away. I checked all my shielding, no wireless signals, no bell, no RF emissions. The black box was still cold to the touch. The power cable was disconnected. It wasn't supposed to be doing anything at all. The next morning, or what I guessed was morning based on the dim light through the western window, I found a file had copied itself into the offline drive I'd connected the night before. No copy prompt, no transfer protocol. It just existed now, labeled in a naming convention I hadn't used since my last mission with EchoCom, D-Class Subdelta, runback, _0-0-1.avx. When I opened it, the file began playing automatically. Audio only, highly degraded, full of environmental contamination. But the content got the content. A voice, male, raspy from dehydration or exposure, was speaking into a chest rig recorder. The transcript, even with automated smoothing, came through haltingly. Mission logs corrupted. Secondary objective unknown. Visibility, nil. Sector oscillation detected. We should not be here. Followed by a long pause, as if the speaker had turned his head away, or lost his nerve. Then, a whispered phrase barely audible. They are behind the metal. A noise followed. Not interference, not wind. A metallic creaking, like steel under pressure. Then footsteps, but not human. Too heavy, too long between each fall. Something dragging. I froze the playback and isolated that sound, looped it over and over, reducing speed and stretching the waveform until the noise was bare. It was recorded in a hollow chamber-likely metallic sublevel, with a reflective reverb indicating a single corridor, perhaps curved. But more than the structure, the sound itself was what mattered. There was a pulse inside the drag. Not a heartbeat and engine, a movement cycle. Like something that shouldn't have motor function, but did. Something walking with synthetic intent. The recording ended with a final word. Ro. Ro, are you listening again? I staggered from my seat. I hadn't said anything. I hadn't spoken my name. But it was clear now I wasn't just a listener. I was being spoken to. Or worse, remembered. I went outside for the first time in over a week, trying to clear my lungs, let some cold air erase the static crawling under my skin. But even the wind had changed. The sound of it, like it was carrying traces of metal along the ridgeline. A faint harmonic ring that wasn't natural. I looked toward the woods, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move between the trees. A reflection, a surface where no light should bounce. I blinked, and it was gone. Back inside, I decided to test the audio response theory. I powered up a separate recorder and addressed the box directly. "What mission are you from?" I asked. "What operation?" I waited. 10 minutes passed. No response. I went to the window, watching the tree line for movement, telling myself I was paranoid, exhausted, that I hadn't slept in nearly 40 hours. Then the recorder clicked. I turned around. The screen was black. A single phrase appeared in green block font. "You were briefed." My blood ran cold. There was no microphone connected. No reason for the box to activate. And the phrase, it wasn't just a statement. It was an accusation. I had been briefed, and I had forgotten. My fingers hovered over the keypad, unsure of whether to shut it all down or go deeper. But the decision was made for me. Without input, the next folder opened itself. A video file this time, labeled _proto_0. No date, no sender. Just a thumbnail and image of a forest, shot from above. With one impossible detail. In the center of the trees, barely visible, was a metallic shape half buried in the foliage. It was the exact configuration of the box, now sitting on my table. The file began to play, and the voice came again. We weren't supposed to find it. We weren't supposed to bring it back. But something brought it back anyway. The cabin walls felt closer now, as if the structure was contracting with each new word. As if the box was asserting spatial authority. It had chosen this place. Or maybe I had built it to receive this moment, long before memory caught up. I didn't eat that day. I didn't leave the room. I just listened. And as the final frames of the video glitched into digital snow, I noticed something terrifying. My own face, shaved, uniformed, reflected in the visor of the reconnaissance drone's camera feed. I wasn't just briefed. I was there, and I had brought the box home. There are moments when memory doesn't return all at once. Like a window flung open in a storm. but instead leaks back in pulses tests, blurs, thermal shadows, clipped voices. And sometimes, what we remember is only a shape, an outline around something we once refused to see. That morning, though, I only knew it was morning because the sky had turned to faint. Electric Gry sat with my hands resting on either side of the black box, staring into the reflection of myself in the screen's standby glass, trying to count how many times I'd seen that face before, in places I was never meant to enter. I had been there. That was certain now. My face in the visor feed wasn't a fabrication. It was a fragment of a day I'd either erased or been ordered to forget. But my name, my voice, my authorization number, all embedded deep in the metadata of this mission, coded like an infection dormant until now. I didn't press anything. The box simply began to speak again, as if following a rhythm it had set long before I became its audience. This time, the voice was clearer, perhaps because the system had recalibrated. Or perhaps because the recording itself was from the early stages of the operation, before the descent, before the noise, before the fracture. Commence insertion. Echo Team Delta Tres confirm altitude and sector clearance. The timestamp read 9:04 Zulu, but no date. The static on the edges of the voice gave away its true nature. Field transmitted, bounced off low-orbit relays, likely from the southern hemisphere. I recognized the operator's voice. After 3 seconds, LT Ilias Neiman. He died in 2007 during a night jump in the Venezuelan exclusion zone. Or at least, that's what the memorial plaque in our debrief facility said. Here, he was alive, alert, and marking entry coordinates for a descent into a no-fly quadrant that hadn't existed on any official atlas. Copy primary. Initiating blackout protocol. Recorders internal only, no uplink. Another voice responded. Mine. I flinched. Understood. Eyes on. The voice was younger, sharper, tinged with a tone I hadn't used in decades. A voice that believed in the chain of command. That still thought the silence meant security. That still trusted that someone, somewhere, would be listening. What followed was a slow crawl of sound, rotors cutting through thick air, wind shifting around fuselage, then boots on dry leaves. The jungle. God. I remembered the heat before I remembered the color. The kind of heat that wraps the lungs in blisters under the eyes. I saw flashes, now thermal images in green and gold. Figures moving like shadows across a canopy, gears strapped to exosuits, HUDs flickering with uncertain readings. We weren't meant to be there. That line came again, over and over, in different voices. Like a mantra, or a realization too late. We weren't supposed to be there. Not because of a political line. Not because of classified territory. But because something else already was. The video feed, inside the black box, now ran in full motion. 6 operatives, all identified by call signs I half remembered from old logs. Nexus, Harpy, Fret, Sigil, Calder, and myself row. We moved through the overgrowth with clinical efficiency. Checking motion sensors, scoping thermal flares, noting that all electromagnetic signals from the area were diffused within a 2-kilometer radius. It wasn't a communications dead zone. It was a null field. Tech readings looped or collapsed into flatlines. Compasses stuttered. A bird call echoed and returned backwards. The first signs of contamination came with the moss. It grew on metal, but not rusted. It was integrated. Not plant life, over structure, becoming organic. The first object we encountered was a panel, fused to the roots of a fallen tree, etched with a symbol I had seen only once before during a deep debrief on Operation Nomad. A sigil in a concentric loop, shaped like a cracked eye, and a waveform fused into a spine. No one spoke when we found it. We just marked the coordinates. That was the first mistake. Marking anything at all. Back in the cabin, the black box's screen began to tremble, not shake. But tremble, like the glass itself, was uncertain of what it displayed. The video now showed the interior of a structure we entered 6 hours later. It wasn't a bunker. It wasn't a lab. It was a shape cut into the terrain, angular and non-Euclidean, with surfaces that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. The team entered in silence. Our suits recorded internal pressures that fluctuated with our breathing. Sigil commented something I'll never forget. It's like the walls are sinking with our hearts. Then came the part that doesn't fit. A voice that wasn't from our team. Not overcomes, not through an echo. It was inside the box's recording, but not from any microphone. A whisper layered beneath the channel. Protocol 0. Confirm presence. Reject, return. It wasn't a command. It was a judgment. And it was followed by a phrase spoken in multiple voices at once, as if the structure itself had been waiting to speak. You broke the silence. You will not leave with it. I remembered something then, not a detail, but a sensation. The final night of that mission, if night even existed in that location. The sensation of being watched, not by eyes, but by memory itself. A presence that had archived our arrival, catalogued our movements, and decided that what we were would not be part of what left. The black box shut down. No warning, no error. Just darkness. I scrambled to power it again, to trigger a restart, but the interface refused all input. I sat back, breathing hard, heart racing with something colder than fear. That phrase wouldn't stop circling in my head. Protocol 0. Not part of any chain I'd ever been trained under. Not even a failsafe. Just a null command, the beginning before beginning. The refusal of origin. My computer, still disconnected from any network, lit up without prompt. A single folder appeared on the desktop, with no origin path, titled OOR, row, vestigial. Inside it, a single .txt file. When I opened it, I found no words. Just a coordinate pair. I recognized the region immediately. It was where we inserted, but the final 6 digits, those were new. I cross-referenced them with modern terrain imaging. Nothing showed on the map. No structures, no clearings. Just a flat patch of forest that had been unchanging since at least 1983. But I knew better. It was there, buried, or hidden. Or perhaps, ... It was moving again. The final line of the file was added before my eyes, letter by letter, as if someone were typing it from beneath my floorboards. They recorded everything, even your exit. There was no debrief, there was only delay. I closed the screen and sat in the silence. But the silence didn't return the same. It was heavier now. Breathing, and somewhere deep in the structure of the black box, a faint click echoed, like a lock inside a lock, turning itself from the inside. I didn't expect it to power itself back on. After the box shut down at the end of the previous log, it had remained inert for nearly a full day, unresponsive to power cycling, signal prompts, and physical manipulation. I had even begun to suspect that its systems operated on some internal schedule or biometric trigger, responding to changes not in circuitry but in proximity, tension, perhaps even my state of awareness. I had drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep around 4 in the morning, slumped in the same chair that had molded itself around my back like the cockpit of a transport drone, when a faint chime stirred me back. It wasn't like before. Not digital. It sounded like a mechanical bell, something you'd hear on a submarine when the depth gauge strikes red. When I turned my head, the box's interface was already lit, casting a narrow glow across the room in a muted shade of green that reminded me of emergency chem lights we used to snap open in blackout zones. The screen displayed a file path with a blinking cursor, /visual_logs/exfil-vo3/cam-0001, and just below it, a timestamp one that made my mouth go dry. Date, 17:00 CT, 2028. Time, 14 hours 44 minutes and 21 seconds UTC. It couldn't be. That was 3 years into the future. 3 years from now. At first I thought it was a placeholder, an auto-generated string from a system whose internal clock had corrupted over time. But then I remembered something impossible. The box had validated my identity. It had a functional, temporal reference. And every other log had carried plausible Zulu times and intervals. This was intentional. The box wasn't confused. It was showing me a date that hadn't happened yet. When I opened the file, the image was shaky. A drone-mounted camera feed, shot from high altitude, descending slowly into dense green cover that broke apart into wide clearing patterns. I recognized the landscape immediately. A jungle quadrant, somewhere along the eastern Andean shelf. We had entered from the western slope during the mission, which meant this was the other side. A place we had never reached. A place we hadn't survived long enough to reach. The footage was silent at first. No wind, no rotors. Just an eerie, almost gelatinous smoothness to the visual data that made me feel like I wasn't watching a camera. but an eye suspended above reality, dreaming the terrain into motion. At the 6-minute mark, the feed stabilized and angled downward. There, in the center of the clearing, was a structure. It wasn't natural. It wasn't old. The lines were smooth, metallic, almost seamless, like the skin of a black aircraft melted into the ground. But it pulsed visibly. Each second, the surface rippled, slightly expanding and contracting in slow biological intervals. There was no exhaust, no intake, no antenna, just a single ridge at the top, and rows of what looked like portholes or embedded lenses aligned in concentric arcs. One of them turned, not mechanically, but subtly. Its reflection changed, and then the camera feed shifted perspective, not geographically, but temporally. I saw it happen. The clearing was the same, but the lighting changed. The sky darkened. Trees in the background disappeared. Debris appeared along the edges of the screen. The timestamp at the corner flickered. Then it updated. 17 OCT, 2028 gives Empat April. Toundori Batujables, gives 22 Jun. 2003 gives Edo Umard. 2042. It was cycling through time, showing different versions of the same place, overlaying them in erratic bursts of visual memory, like the ground was remembering everything that had ever been there, and everything that would be. Then the camera descended. It shouldn't have. The footage had no operator, no manual correction. But the drone began to drop slowly, approaching the structure. At approximately 45 meters above the surface, the central ridge split open, revealing an interior that defied orientation. The inside did not contain rooms or corridors. It contained reflections mirrors that did not show the drone, but faces. My face. My team. I saw Neiman, Sigil, even Harpy, whose body we never recovered. All of them appeared, one by one, flickering into the panels as the drone dropped further in. Then, at 32 meters, the drone froze mid-air, not by choice. The footage simply ceased moving, but the timestamp kept ticking. It was locked in space, but time continued. And at 14 hours, 44 minutes and 43 seconds UTC, the camera panned slightly just enough to catch a figure standing behind the drone. No aircraft, no wings, just a human outline, too tall, too still, composed of soft angles that seemed to warp the air around it. Its head was smooth. Its arms hung motionless. And its skinner, what I thought was skin, looked like a wet sheet of black glass. The feed cut there. Not too black, but to my own face, again, staring into the screen. I flinched so hard I nearly threw the monitor. But it wasn't a live feed. It was an old image. Or a future one. In the image, I looked older. My hair was thinner. There was a scar on my jawline I didn't yet have. And the look on my face wasn't fear. It was understanding. As if I had already seen what I was about to see next. Below the image, the screen displayed a phrase in the same green block text. Synchronization, 62%, authorizing visual return. I didn't know what that meant, but I felt something shift in the cabin. A sound like shifting air behind drywall. The smell of rust. The faint hum of something too quiet to be electronic. I stood slowly, walked to the door, and opened it. Outside, nothing had changed. The trees were still. The ground was wet from mist. But I saw it barely etched in the dirt, where my boot prints had been the day before. Coordinates. In my own handwriting. Coordinates matching the clearing from the feed. Written by me, but I had no memory of doing it. I looked back at the box, then at the sky. And for a second I swore I saw a shimmer, hexagonal distortion in the clouds, like a lens flare without a source. It flickered once, then was gone. Back inside, the screen was dark again. But the box had left me something new. A folder, labeled /confirmed, /recursion_log, / with a single note inside. They opened the structure in 2028. You left in 2007. But something followed your signal back. I couldn't process it. I didn't want to. But deep in my bones, I knew what it was saying. The camera didn't just capture the future, it anchored it. And whatever that structure was, it had seen me. It had remembered me. And now, it was beginning to return the gaze. The problem with memory is that it comes back wrong. It doesn't return as it was, but filtered rearranged through the skin, through the angles of light, through the slight vibrations in the floorboards when your hand brushes against something it shouldn't remember. That night, or whatever fragment of darkness passed for night, now that I had covered the cabin windows with insulation foam and blackout film, I didn't sleep. I sat in a steady loop of playback, reading through the system's recursive files, watching the drone footage over and over, waiting for the figure behind the lens to blink, or vanish, or reach out. But it never changed. Frame for frame, always there, like a fixed point in a fractured timeline, mocking me with its absolute stillness. What disturbed me more than the figure itself was the feeling I had seen it before. Not just in the recording, not just in the distorted overlays or visual noise, but somewhere older, buried, a silhouette behind fog, a hum beneath silence. The kind of thing you spend your whole life forgetting, on purpose, only to have it arrive on your porch inside a box that knows your name. At 2:17 a.m., the screen blinked again, without prompt. This time, there was no dramatic chime, no eerie vibration. Just a silent command window, and a flickering command. Phase, Black Initiate. The term hit me with a full-body chill. It wasn't a public protocol. It wasn't in the operational handbook. It was the kind of term whispered in closed corridors, across half-first documents, during contingency briefings that required 2 separate DNA verifications to unlock. Phase Black wasn't a procedure. It was a surrender. A silent agreement that if what you encountered couldn't be contained, controlled, or explained, your only order was to vanish. No return, no exfil, no report, only erasure. I didn't touch the keyboard. I didn't say anything. The screen blinked twice, and then launched itself anyway, as if my consent was irrelevant now. The footage that followed wasn't drone. It wasn't even body cam. It was internal suit feed, my own, I realized slowly, based on the telemetry in the bottom corner. Heart 122 BPM. Hydro levels low. Audio active. Time, unknown. Date, redacted. Location, subdelta. 09 AXIS. The suit's breathing loop was loud, mechanical, bordering on panicked. I could hear myself trying to slow it, counting silently under my breath, but failing. The screen shook violently, indicating rapid movement through narrow passageways, possibly descending or crawling, and all sound was undercut by a humolo, vibrating resonance that bled into the audio stream like a second pulse. I recognized this moment, not from a file, from my bones, from the part of myself that still woke up sweating, even after all these years, convinced there was something still attached to my spine, some remnant signal pulsing between me and a structure that no one officially excavated. The feed showed a moment of stillness, me, kneeling behind an outcropping of black, polished stone inside a chamber that defied layout. The walls were curved, but not symmetrically. They bent in irregular arcs, forming surfaces that reflected nothing, absorbing even the light from the suit's floodlamp. Across the room stood Sigil, frozen mid-step, his weapon half-raised, eyes glassy. His voice came through cums like he was submerged. "Ro, do you see it? Do you see the sky inside?" The camera turned. There, on the far end of the chamber, was a fissure. Not in the wall, not in the floor. In reality, I don't know how else to describe it. A vertical gash in the air itself, shimmering like oil on water, but deeper layered within it. I saw stars. But they didn't move. They watched. Like eyes pretending to be constellations, waiting for us to step forward and blink first. My recorded voice whispered something I couldn't remember ever saying. "There's no wind here. That's how you know it's not a room." The feed distorted. The video fragmented for 13 seconds, returning mid-motion, as I pulled Sigil back from the fissure. He was bleeding from both ears. His mouth moved, but no sound emerged. Behind him, the fissure pulsed once, and something stepped through. The recording caught only the edge of the figure, blurred and translucent, as if half its body was still in another frame of time. It dragged a sound behind it. Not footsteps intent, like pressure made audible. The next 60 seconds were chaos, screaming, metal shearing, suit alarms. I tried to issue an override to the feed, but the system refused to skip. It wanted me to see it again, to remember everything. The final frame of the feed showed the chamber empty. Sigil was gone. I was gone. Only the fissure remained, now smaller, but still leaking light like veins inside a dying star. The screen went black, but a single audio cue continued. My voice, again, calm now. Resigned. Phase black. Initiated. No return code. Mission null. If this log survives, delete it. If it doesn't, you were never here. I sat in my chair, staring at the screen, heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood in my ears. The box made a soft clicking sound, not mechanical, organic, like vertebrae realigning. Then it displayed a prompt. Phase black, confirmed continuation log. Ready? It was asking me to continue a log I had apparently already begun. Not recorded, lived. I reached for the keyboard, fingers trembling, when I heard something I hadn't heard in years. A knock, slow, deliberate. On the back wall of the cabin. The wall that faced the ridge. The wall with no door, no path, no approach. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. Not heavy, just intentional. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The black box pulsed once. Then, as if responding to the sound, it displayed a final message before shutting itself off again. You were not supposed to come back. I didn't sleep. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in darkness, listening, waiting, wondering if the knock would come again. It didn't. But something deeper than sound lingered. A weight. A presence pressing through the cracks in the wood, through the seams in memory. Something watching from the other side of phase black. Not because it couldn't reach me, but because it wasn't finished sinking yet. I've spent enough years around classified manifests to know their finality. They are more than documents, they are rituals of control. Boxers ticked by people who understand that forgetting isn't just an accident, but sometimes a necessity. Every mission I ever entered had one. A manifest of names, ranks, blood types, psychological baselines, and predetermined eulogies, written in the coldest future tense. They were insurance against uncertainty, the official record to be upheld when everything else collapsed into conjecture. I had seen mine. I had signed it. Row KL. Assigned Echo, come, Delta 3, Task Unit 6. 5 operators total. We were briefed, pre-cleared, and sent to retrieve data from a location whose real name never appeared on any mission document. Only referred to as Subdelta Zone 09. That part never changed. What changed, what never should have changed, was the name that appeared now. On the screen, burned into the playback file, the box decrypted for me just before dawn. The box had remained silent for hours, inert and blank, as if digesting the log it had just displayed, or waiting for my nervous system to settle into a state where it could begin again. At 4:31 a.m., the pulse light reawakened, blinking twice in a regular rhythm before stabilizing. A soft chime accompanied the screen's return. No prompt this time, no question, only a list. 5 names, familiar, expected, Nexus, Harpy, Sigil, Calder, Row. But there was a 6th entry below them now. Subject ID, 0455M. Assigned designate, Lyra. No rank. No photo. No biometric profile. No entry point. I stared at it, mouth half open, unable to reconcile what I was seeing with what I remembered. We were 5. We were always 5. We did the physicals together. We reviewed topography data in briefing rooms that smelled like old sweat and recycled air. There were only 5 beds in the forward prep module. 5 cots arranged with military symmetry, 5 names etched into the inner wall panel beside the exit chute. There was never a 6th. I told myself this, like a mantra, over and over, as if repetition could prevent the name from settling into my memory. But it didn't. The longer I stared, the more it began to feel not unfamiliar, but concealed. The screen shifted. A new file opened. No video, only audio. Crude quality, marred by interference and audio clipping, but unmistakably from the body cams of the mission's second night. Voices passed over each other in brief clips, fragments of conversation before the signal degradation reached full entropy. Then, a voice I couldn't identify, female.com, slow cut through the chaos. You were not supposed to bring the structure this far north, she said. The soil isn't prepared. It doesn't remember you yet. The words made no sense, not even metaphorically. We hadn't moved anything. We weren't equipped for extraction. Our job was intel only. Observe, log, isolate energy sources, retrieve samples if accessible. and confirm or refute the existence of the anomalous geometry reported in satellite scans. I replayed the file. The voice was there again. Not one of ours. I extracted the vocal profile and ran a comparative scan against the 5 original team members. No match. The software hesitated for a moment before offering a suggestion. Possible alignment with LYRA, subject ID 0455M. The file originated internally. The timestamp aligned with the same hour SIGIL disappeared. So why didn't I remember her? How could someone accompany us through jungle and heat and blackout comes without being burned into the scar tissue of my recollection? I dug deeper, rescanned all previous audio logs, ran a filter for female vocal range. And there she was. Faint, almost always in the background. A hum, a whisper, a reply. Never direct, never logged, but present. Once, during a break in the trek, someone I think called her asked, "Do you think she's even human?" To which I clearly responded, "Does it matter, if she's leading us out?" But when I heard the phrase again, it didn't trigger a memory. Triggered disorientation, like remembering a dream from childhood you were certain you never had. Her presence wasn't simply forgotten. It had been nested in my memory in a way that required permission to resurface. And now that the box had shown me her name, it couldn't be unremembered. The logs continued. At 11:42 p.m., on what must have been day 3, the team came to a sudden halt in the perimeter of an unnatural depression in the terrain. The ground sloped downward unnaturally, like something immense had settled beneath the surface long ago, and left only its gravity behind. In the center of this depression was a column, smooth, black, crystalline. No seams, no markings. It hummed not audibly, but through suit sensors, as if vibrating against the nervous system rather than air. And LYRAN seen in the footage, but heard said something strange. This is where they stacked time. It's thinner here, like ash. From there the logs become increasingly surreal. Orientation was lost. The mission clock ceased, progressing linearly. Entries overlapped. In one, we're climbing. In the next, we're descending. The sun sets, then rises in the wrong direction. The column remains central, always visible, regardless of our movement. And then, one by one, the voices go silent. Harpy's feed ends in static. Calder shows him walking into an alcove that doesn't appear on drone maps. SIGIL, as already known, vanishes mid-frame after staring too long into the fissure. And Lyra, she begins appearing in reflections. In the glossy parts of our visors. In the water pooled near the roots. Sometimes just her eyes. Sometimes a full silhouette. Never facing the camera. Always close. As if orbiting the mission like a moon we forgot to acknowledge. And then there's me, the last log. Standing alone beside the column, breathing hard, suit pressure elevated, heart rate at 160. No comes, no exit point. Just one sentence repeated over and over. Phase black confirmed. I understand now. There were never supposed to be 5. I don't remember saying that. But the voice is mine. The cadence is mine. And the resignation that's mine too. Back in the cabin, the box blinked once more. A file auto-opened with the mission manifest now, retroactively corrected. Team size 6. My name was still there. But at the bottom, beneath it all, written in the same glyph-like font used in the earlier recursive logs, appeared one more phrase, untranslated by the software, but familiar in its shape. The sigil of the cracked eye and spine. It pulsed softly on screen, as if breathing. I closed the terminal. The pulse in the room shifted. Not louder, not faster, just closer. I hadn't brought the box back. I hadn't been the courier. But something had followed me anyway. And now, for the first time in my life, I began to wonder if Lyra had never been part of the team at all. Not because she wasn't real, but because she was always part of the structure. Part of whatever watches from the other side of names. The sound came before the light did. A soft, low-frequency modulation that settled in the wood of the cabin and pulsed, like a heartbeat, not entirely mine. I hadn't touched the box since the last log ended, hadn't even looked at it for more than a few seconds each hour. As if breaking the line of sight might keep it from reacting again. But I knew it wasn't dormant. The air was too charged, the shadows too dense along the floorboards, the animals outside too quiet. Nothing in the forest had moved for hours, not a single wing beat. Not the hoot of a night bird. not the crackle of an insect underfoot. It was as if the entire landscape had entered the same kind of listening state the box had taught me to recognize. Attention that deepened, not with action, but with restraint. At 3:06 a.m., the wind returned, but it was different now. It wasn't passing through the trees. It was being emitted from them, carried from inside the trunks, not around them. When I opened the door, the pine wall beyond the porch was trembling slightly, needles shivering in place without a breeze. I stepped barefoot into the dirt, heart slamming behind my ribs, breath held for no reason I could articulate, and listened. The trees were screaming. It wasn't loud, not in the way a siren is loud. It was structural, a pressure, a sound like a whisper turned inside out. You didn't hear it in your ears. You felt it in your spine, in the fluid of your joints, in the membrane of your eyes. It was a chorus without mouths, a tone without melody, a long sustained groan that came from the core of each trunk and carried in waves toward the clearing. I stumbled back inside and locked the door out of instinct, which felt almost laughably inadequate, but the movement grounded me for a moment. I checked the pulse light on the box. It had shifted from red to a pale green I hadn't seen before. The screen came on. This time there was no file tree, no menu prompt, just a single word in a wide monochrome font. Listen. The screen flashed once, and a new video began. This wasn't from a drone, or from the body cams. It was too steady, too centralized. A fixed-angle camera, mounted likely to the hull of the original dropship that brought us in. The timestamp read 108 Zulu, Mission Day 0. This was pre-deployment, footage I never had access to, recorded from outside the mission manifest's standard log. The video showed us standing in the tree line, arranging gear, running cum checks, laughing under our breath like people who didn't yet know what was missing. And there off, to the left, half-shadowed under a thick curl of vinestone, someone else. A woman, hair tied back, expression unreadable. She wasn't part of the loading manifest. Her name wasn't spoken, but everyone moved around her like she belonged. We called her Lyra. The footage confirmed it. She nodded when Calder asked if she had recalibrated the sensor mics. She answered when Harpy joked about wearing 2 tags instead of 1. But her voice was muffled, like it never quite traveled the distance to the microphone. Like it was being filtered, even then. Then, a second later, something changed. The video glitched briefly, subtly. The trees in the background shifted in shape. Their bark darkened. Their branches bent in unnatural arcs. It lasted maybe half a second, but it was enough. I scrubbed backward. Frame by frame, I advanced until the anomaly revealed itself again. The exact frame it happened, the entire forest appeared to curve inward. Not physically, not as if swaying with wind, but optically, like the lens of the world itself had warped. In that frame, every tree had a face. Not a literal one, no eyes. No lip spot, a geometry of knots and shadows and branching that unmistakably formed human features. Screaming features, hundreds of them. All mouths open, all directed at us. I turned away from the screen, fighting nausea. The pressure in my skull had returned, not a headache but a weight, like my thoughts were being siphoned. I wrapped the terminal in an old wool blanket, shut off every breaker in the cabin, and stepped back outside. But the trees were no longer still. Their trunks vibrated in time with the sound, not creaking, singing. A frequency that came and went in long sustained harmonics, that never quite looped, but always resolved into something worse. Like language, degraded. The longer I stood there, the more I could feel it organizing. Like it was mapping me. Back inside, the screen had turned itself back on again, this time displaying a file I hadn't accessed. Not a log, not a video, a schematic. The visual represented a field of trees, but overlaid with pulsar-like emission points and nodal networks that extended underground and terminated in something. Below the subsoil level, a shape not unlike the column we had encountered. Except this one wasn't inert. It glowed softly at the center. The schematic displayed a caption in faint lettering. Subdelta, O9 network sector, Verge emission type, phonic by logic objective, received signal. Below that, a question. Did they hear you first? Or were they only answering? I couldn't move. Not because I was paralyzed, but because I finally understood the inversion. We had gone into the forest to find a signal, to detect something anomalous. But the truth was older, deeper. The trees weren't broadcasting now. They always had been. The forest wasn't reacting to the box, it had produced it. Or something that used the trees as lungs, the soil as resonance chamber, the faces in bark as pressure valves for memory. Every noise we had ever made in the field, every footfall, every breath had been recorded not by gear, but by the environment itself. I turned to the wall behind the box, stared at the wooden planks of the cabin that had always felt safe, solid, man-made. Then I saw it. A knot in the wood I had never noticed before. Subtle, misaligned. Its grain shaped into something that looked like an open mouth, wide and hollow. I closed my eyes, leaned forward, and listened. Just beyond it, I could hear breathing. Not mine. The box flickered again, finalizing the schematic, and added a single line of code to the bottom. The trees remember all who speak. The trees remember even those who were erased. I backed away. Heartbeat now uncontrolled, every nerve in my body twitching as if bracing for an explosion I couldn't locate. This was not about surveillance. This was about integration. EchoCom had been sent to investigate a signal source in a compromised zone. But we weren't the first to enter. We were the first to be remembered properly. Our words, our movements, our decisions fed back into a loop of biological resonance, filtered through the bark and made permanent. The screaming outside didn't grow louder. It grew clearer. I began to understand pieces of it now. Names, numbers, phrases in languages I didn't know, I knew. Then one word, spoken in the resonance, not by voice, but by tension. Row, not shouted. Whispered, not summoned. Acknowledged. I collapsed to the floor. The wood was cold, damp with condensation, but not from the weather. It was weeping, slowly, as if the humidity was being pushed through from the other side. I stared up at the rafters, and finally understood why I had come to this place after the mission. Why I had isolated myself. Why I had always heard the trees at night, even when there was no wind. Because the forest had followed me, not in body, in memory. And now, it had synchronized fully. The mission wasn't over. It had never ended. It had simply shifted locations. From Subdelta 09 to me. I kept the schematic on the screen longer than I should have, staring at the cluster of nodes, as though by understanding their shape, I could make sense of the madness. The diagram shifted slowly in real time, like watching roots crawl beneath skin, dragging neural connections through the soil beneath the cabin, bending toward a center I couldn't see. The more I zoomed in, the less the coordinates matched any terrain I knew. Latitudinal and longitudinal data that should have placed the node clusters in the Andes suddenly resolved into a grid formation hovering over my current GPS location, but fluctuating every few seconds. The cabin wasn't marked. Not directly, but something was circling it. The sectors lit up in sequence, overlapping like a radar sweep. And the soil around me mapped in faint green lattice, no longer red as inert. It had begun to reflect feedback. Bioelectric fields, electromagnetic pockets, pressure signatures too faint to attribute to tectonics. There were no animals left nearby to blame, just trees, and dirt, and the box humming louder than before. Then the coordinate string blinked. I had seen it stabilize at 234311.7 S, 672350, 6.1 W, a familiar point along the Bolivian border near our original drop site. But now, second by second, the values began to drift. South by microdegrees, then west, then east again. A kind of orbital decay, except there was no object. Only an origin that refused to stay fixed. I watched as the movement became rhythmic, swinging back and forth in loops of decreasing radius, like something tightening its grip around a point it hadn't fully defined yet. The implication dawned slowly. The location wasn't a place. It was following something, or someone. I cross-referenced the current coordinate with my cabin's last logged position. They were now separated by less than 4 kilometers. That made no sense. I hadn't moved. But somehow, it had. I shut off the schematic and opened the audio logs. The box provided me with a new file, labeled simply, followed _vector _OOA. The clip began mid-breath. My voice again, but strained and older, whispering numbers I didn't recognize. ... 50, Deltanine, corridor breach. No true north, no true north. Repeat coordinates spiral when watched, lock eyes only with exit points. ... Then a gasp, a pause, and the sound of shuffling against metal, like something crawling through narrow ductwork. A final word emerged, half-spoken, half-thought. "Don't mark it, it marks back." The recording ended with a hard click. No context, no timestamp, no verification. Just my voice, speaking from a place I had never been or had refused to remember. I moved through the cabin like a trapped animal, checking the walls for anything new. I pulled insulation from the floorboards, lifted tile, checked behind old maps. The black box remained silent, but every time I glanced at it, I felt heat. Not from electricity, from proximity. As if it were becoming aware of the attention I gave it, responding with thermal acknowledgement. I was being mapped, not by satellite, not by drone, but by a memory structure so old, so vast, that it could simulate gravity through recall alone. Then the walls shifted. It wasn't a movement I could prove, not something seismic or architectural. But they breathed. The wood panels along the cabin's eastern wall seemed to expand slightly, then pull inward. The change was microscopic, but my body knew it. The air pressure adjusted. My balance wavered. And somewhere outside, a flock of crows exploded from the trees in complete silence, wings flapping without a single sound. I looked at the ground, and for the first time noticed that my boot prints from the day before were gone, not washed away. Gone, like the soil had reconnected itself. Erased my presence. I bent down, pressed my hand to the dirt. It felt warm. Too warm. Back inside, the box had drawn a line across the screen. A vector map, projected from a central node, marked RZ117GH my identifier. The lines extended out like spider legs, curving, twisting, updating every 10 seconds, each one terminating in a new set of coordinates. Some hovered over water, some over Arctic ice shelves, but most pointed back to me. The terminal lit up with a single blinking phrase, "You are the current location." My breath caught. The trees had gone silent again. Even the screaming had paused, replaced by a stillness that rang in my ears like tinnitus. The forest was waiting, listening to see what I would do next. I scrolled deeper into the log structure, and found another folder I hadn't seen before. Partially corrupted but recoverable archive. Personal relocation _attempts. Inside were 3 video files. I opened the first. It was blurry, shaky footage of a man running night vision, enabled crashing through underbrush. His voice came in gasps. Can't shake it. Still tracking every time I stop, it adjusts coordinates collapse inward. Then the video broke into static. The second file showed a bunker interior. Concrete walls. The man again, same voice. I blocked GPS. Removed my tags. Replaced my blood. Doesn't matter. It follows what's remembered. You can't bury what's recorded. The final file was of me, or a version of me. Older again. Unshaven. Eyes hollow. Sitting in what looked like a supply container. Snow pressed against the seams. He was holding a piece of paper with coordinates written over and over. His voice came softly like wind through teeth. You think you can escape a map you helped draw, but your breath's still on it. Your fingerprints still in the static. The black box isn't just replaying data. It's feeding you back to the network. Over and over. Until you're not an operator. You're an echo. I slammed the screen closed. The cabin groaned once, a soft creak through the frame. Not from wind, from recognition. I paced until my legs shook. There was no exit plan now. No escape route. The trees didn't surround me, they remembered me into place. I had tried to forget the mission. Tried to go quiet, off-grid, dissolve into background noise. But the mission hadn't ended because the coordinates hadn't stopped moving. They adjusted every time I breathed. Every time I whispered a memory aloud. Every time I fed them a new vector by wondering if any of it had been real. Outside, the forest shimmered slightly at the edge of my vision. Not visibly, not like light. But like a dream you start to wake up from, only to realize the world around you isn't the one you remember. I opened the terminal one last time that night. The prompt blinked gently, ready for return. I didn't know what that meant. Not anymore. Return to where? To the site. To the network. To the version of me that still existed inside the box. I hesitated, then typed. No. The screen pulsed once. Then it answered, refusal noted. Adjusting coordinates accordingly. And with that, The lines on the map began to draw inward, all vectors collapsing, folding like ribs into a spine, until the map itself shrank into a single pulsing dot. My location, the new fixed point. The eye of a storm made of memory, signal, and breath. I stared until the screen dimmed, and the pulse light faded back to red. Then I turned off every device in the cabin, and sat in the dark, waiting for the world to shift around me again. Because it would. Because it already had. It began again with the static. Not the thin, analog hiss of a failing speaker, or the clean digital distortion of corrupted files, but the dense, wet static that coats your ears in silence when you've gone too deep underwater, and the weight of the world above presses through the cartilage and into your skull. I was inside it before I realized it had returned thick in the cabin, humming behind the walls, bleeding into the wooden grains like mildew. The pulse light on the black box had shifted again, no longer red, no longer green, but a gray so dark it looked like the absence of illumination itself. I approached it cautiously, aware now that proximity no longer guaranteed sequence, that the logs could be scrambled or recursive, the structure of memory rearranged by the box's own calculations. But this was different. There was no log title, no menu. Just one phrase, stenciled faintly at the top of the screen. You were already here. Then the screen flickered, and the playback began. The first frame was upside down. The camera mine was mounted to my suit's collar at the time, recording as we moved through what was logged in the mission transcript as Cavern 3 Beta. The video corrected its orientation automatically as it stabilized, revealing a narrow corridor of smooth stone ahead, with inlaid veins of what appeared to be reflective mineral threading through the walls. It didn't match any geological records I'd seen. The structure was natural in shape, but alien in consistency. Light did not behave normally there. Every beam from our lamps bent and spiraled, sometimes crossing its own path, sometimes refracting backward, as if repelled. Our footsteps echoed unevenly, not in volume, but in sequence. A step would land, and its echo would return before the sound reached our ears, as if the corridor was remembering the motion before the impact. Sigil muttered something about quantum reverb, but the coms clipped before I could respond. We were following Lyra. Or perhaps we weren't. The footage was unclear. A figure ahead, always in frame, always just around the bend. She never turned back, never adjusted her pace, but the distance between us never changed. No matter how fast we moved, she remained the same number of meters away, fixed, like a projection cast forward from a point we couldn't reach. I remember thinking at the time that perhaps she was leading us deeper, that there was a goal buried within this formation. Something we hadn't been authorized to know, but had already been drafted to encounter. The mission had always felt preordained, but this corridor confirmed it. None of us questioned the geometry. We moved through a landscape that responded not to physics, but to intent. The more we focused on movement, the more the corridor elongated. But when we thought of exit, of turning back, the walls closed slightly, barely perceptible, like lungs growing impatient. We reached the gate at 317 Zulu. The log feed labeled it Mirror Gate, though that name was never given during the mission, not verbally. I have no memory of calling it that. Yet here it was, etched into the metadata by someone, or something, that understood the importance of designation. The Mirror Gate stood at the end of the corridor, a perfect vertical ellipse of mirrored material embedded into the stone. It didn't reflect our image. It reflected our positions. Each of us was there, standing in front of it, but instead of seeing ourselves, we saw versions of our posture slightly out of synchromes, at rest when ours were raised. Heads tilted differently, eyes not blinking in rhythm. We didn't move. I remember the weight of stillness, then, more than anything else. Like the gate required silence to remain closed. Harpy broke the silence first, reaching out to touch the surface. I tried to stop him, but it was too late. His gloved hand met the surface, and there was no sound. No energy discharge, just absorption. His arm passed through slowly, without resistance, without distortion. When he tried to pull back, he gasped. Not in pain, in disbelief. His body had vanished in the reflection. Only his face remained in the mirror now, blinking independently of him, mouth frozen in an expression he wasn't making. He said something low. It's watching me. It's not me, but it knows me. Then his voice split, not an echo, a separate signal, one high-pitched and reversed, speaking the same phrase backward in Swanky Cheetah Bintang. The rest of us stood frozen. Sigil raised his scanner, but it failed to register depth. The mirror had no interior. It was a coordinate, not a destination. A point fixed in an informational topology, rather than physical geography. I stepped forward only half a step, and the mirror shifted. My own reflection came into view, but it was already turned toward me. I hadn't moved, but the man in the mirror had. He tilted his head and raised his hand slowly, palm out, and my comes filled with a sharp pulsing interference, like static embedded with breath. Lyra, ahead of us, finally spoke. It is not a mirror. It is an archive. It shows what it remembers, not what is. We turned toward her. She was closer now, though she had never moved. And when I looked back, the gate had changed. There were now two images of me, one standing as I was, the other facing away. Walking deeper into a landscape that did not exist behind the gate, but was visible through it nonetheless. A forest, not the one we entered from, but one that mirrored my cabin's edge, pines, fog. A single antenna rising through the mist. The gate was reflecting a place I had not yet reached, but clearly would. Contact was lost at 321 Zulu. Not suddenly, not with a scream, but with silence. Each of our suit feeds cut out in succession, starting with Harpy, then Calder, then Sigil. Mine remained, but only as telemetry. The video blacked out, audio clipped. All that remained was the heartbeat, monitor steady, then nothing, then a single blip. The signal didn't go offline, it inverted. The metadata reversed. Coordinates scrolled backward. The mission log file renamed itself in real time. Entry, mirror, _gate, exit, null, no exfil, no return, no code. Back in the cabin, the screen froze on that phrase. Exit, null. I watched it until the letters blurred, eyes burning from exhaustion, knowing I had crossed a threshold with no defined edge. The cabin felt unfamiliar now, larger in places, smaller in others. I noticed that the floor near the box had warped slightly, not from weight, but from heat, or perhaps pressure. And when I opened the window for the first time in hours, I saw footprints outside. Bare, human, facing the wall, then turning, walking away. But not mine. The box powered down gently. No fanfare, no pulse. Only a line of final text before it dimmed to black. One of you stayed, one of you returned. You must choose which you are. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the mirror gate not closed, not waiting, but watching. As if its surface was still calibrated to me, still showing a future I hadn't agreed to, but would fulfill regardless. And through the glass, beyond the reflection of myself, I saw something moving in the fog, not approaching. Just observing, as if trying to decide whether I had returned the right way, or if I was only the memory of someone who never truly left. The morning, if that word still had meaning in the frame of whatever time I now inhabited, came with a new sound. Not the trees, they had gone quiet again. Withdrawn into that haunting silence that felt less like peace, and more like the held breath of something calculating. The sound was internal. Not from the box, not from the forest, not from outside the walls at all. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. I had heard it before, though never clearly. And until now, I had dismissed it as the natural groan of old wood, or pressure shifts from the underground frost. But this was different. It was rhythmic, measured. It pulsed like a slow sonar ping buried beneath the earth, or the last breath of a hibernating machine waking from a memory it was never meant to replay. The first thing I noticed as I stepped toward it was that the black box, silent now, inert for nearly 9 hours, remained cold. It wasn't the source. The signal was coming from deeper. I pulled back the rug I'd thrown down months ago. Not to decorate, but to forget the damage I'd caused one night in a fit of near-panic. There, in the center of the cabin, where 2 boards had cracked and splintered from being kicked loose, I saw it a hairline seam in the subfloor I'd never seen before. Or maybe it had always been there, and I simply hadn't known what to look for. I ran my fingers across the edges. Warm, too warm. I fetched my crowbar, hesitated, then wedged it beneath the seam and pulled. The plank lifted cleanly, almost too easily, like it had been waiting. Beneath it, not insulation, not beams, not soil, but a flat matte panel of black composite material. Seamless, no screws. No labels. Just a single recessed indentation at the center. My breath caught. It was the same material as the black box. The same curvature. The same sheen. But larger. Wider. Embedded directly into the house's foundation. I dropped to my knees and placed my hand over the panel. A vibration throbbed beneath my palm, not mechanical. Not electrical. Biological. Like resting your hand against the chest of something alive in deep sleep. It pulsed in time with nothing I could measure, but its pattern was familiar. 3 short, 2 long, 1 rising tone, then pause, then repeat. I pressed my ear to the surface, and for the first time heard the signal clearly. Not just pulses, not just tremors, a voice, my own. I didn't scream, I didn't flinch. I had no energy left for disbelief. The voice was degraded, filtered, as if traveling through layers of dirt and memory, but it was unmistakably me. Repeating a phrase over and over. They said we wouldn't return. They didn't say anything about the others. We are still transmitting. Underneath. I stood slowly and retrieved my Signa decoder, an old piece of military tech I had salvaged years ago and repurposed for solar telemetry. I tuned it to passive mode and placed the receiver coil over the panel. The interface lit up instantly, a clean spike. Frequency, 3.14 MHz. It shouldn't have been there. That bandwidth hadn't been used for anything terrestrial in decades. I ran a signal trace and watched in silence as the decoder returned location data, not a coordinate, a depth, 12.4 meters. There was something directly beneath the cabin, transmitting with my voice, using an obsolete frequency range to replay a message I had never consciously recorded. The file system of the decoder, populated with a waveform labeled row, _loop, _main, archival _repeat, auth, accepted. The file was massive, corrupted in places, fragmented, but intact. I initiated playback. The first 30 seconds were static, then breath, then me, again. This is subject 04RZ117GH. Phase black, failed. Containment failed. Mirror gate is still open. This message is for whichever version of me survives. You need to understand what came through wasn't content to reflect. It started recording, a pause. Then more, desperate now. They built it to study recursion, but it learned faster than they expected. It doesn't mimic, it archives. We were just the first full imprint. The cabin isn't a hiding place, it's a node. You came here because it remembered this place as safe. But you were wrong. You were remembering what it allowed. I stopped the recording, pulled away from the decoder like it had burned me. I could feel my heartbeat in my teeth. I sat down hard against the wall, staring at the exposed panel, unable to stop the rising awareness that my memories had never been entirely mine. The black box hadn't sent the message. It had received it. From below. From something beneath my feet that was storing fragments of me like a recursive backup, looping them through a signal meant not to communicate, but to synchronize. The black box had never been the source. It was an interface. I turned back, toward the rest of the room. Everything looked the same, but only in shape. The objects I had grown, used to the chair, the stove, the cot each now held a slight wrongness to them. A subtle shift in dimension. A texture misplaced. A corner too sharp. The cabin was being remembered incorrectly. Or rather, it was being rendered by something whose understanding of it came not from reality, but from recordings of recordings, as if the architecture itself was passing through a lossy algorithm. The trees began to tremble again, this time not in voice, but in anticipation. The pressure outside dropped. I opened the door slowly, and for the first time saw them in their entirety. Not trees. Not anymore. Towers. Organic antennae, draped in the shape of pines. Their upper limbs curled toward the sky like open receivers. Mouths silent, eyes closed, but listening. They weren't here to transmit. They were absorbing the signal from beneath the cabin, from the thing that wore my voice. I returned inside and opened the box again. It hummed softly, screen blank. Then, one word appeared. Down. It wasn't a question. It was a direction, a command, or a response. I moved without conscious thought, dragging the rest of the floorboards free. Beneath the panel, seams became visible 4 corners, sharp, angular, like a hatch. I pried them open. Beneath was a tunnel, A shaft, narrow, lined in the same black material, descending into darkness so complete, I could feel the weight of it even before the light disappeared. I stood at the edge for a long time, listening. The voice returned, barely audible, rising through the shaft like heat. You've already descended. This is just the loop, remembering how it began. I didn't descend that night. I closed the hatch and laid on the floor above it, listening to the pulse echo through the boards, feeling it move in sync with my breath. I slept there for an hour, maybe two, long enough to dream, but not deeply. And when I woke, the hatch was open again, and something somewhere far beneath was humming the same tone I used to whistle when I thought I was alone. I spent most of that day watching the hatch, as though expecting something to rise through it, and announce that the decision was no longer mine to make. The pulsing from below had grown steadier, more deliberate, no longer just a hum or heartbeat, but something closer to breath filtered through memory, rhythmic, faintly organic, and threaded with an unmistakable awareness. The signal hadn't stopped. It had changed frequencies. I didn't realize it at first. The instruments were silent. The decoder flatlined. But the sound remained, curling around the edges of cognition in a way that bypassed the eardrum and went directly into thought. I heard nothing, and yet I knew exactly what it was saying. I stood at the edge of the hatch, staring down into the shaft, the air unmoving and dry, no heat, no sound, no light. It was as if the tunnel existed outside the rules of the physical world. A line drawn not between rooms, but between conditions of reality. I didn't go down, not yet. Not then. I still had the black box. The moment I turned my attention back to it, it responded. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't spoken. I simply looked, and that was enough. The screen blinked to life and displayed a line of text I had never typed, never spoken, but knew to be mine. Why do I keep remembering wrong? The words pulsed once, then dissolved, and a new phrase replaced them, because memory is passive. You gave it permissions long ago. Then, the playback began not from a stored file, not from the decoder, but in real time, as if something within the box was now waiting for me to speak. I sat down slowly. My heart rate increased, as if reacting to something it recognized, but couldn't defend against. I whispered, "What are you?" And the black box replied, not in sound, but in audio fed through the decoder that had remained inactive until that exact moment. The waveform jumped. The speakers hissed. Then my own voice came back. What you archived. What you broadcast. What you needed to forget. There was no distortion, no pitch shift. It was my voice, unaltered, but speaking independently of me. I froze, hand trembling near the volume dial, unsure if muting the signal would break the loop or provoke it. I asked another question, quieter this time. Why now? The reply came through within seconds. Because you're alone. Because the signal is loudest in isolation. You built this place because it already existed in the memory of the network. You only thought it was your idea. I stared at the decoder, jaw clenched. The cabin, the distance, the coordinates. Had it all been suggested, planted? A recursive echo misinterpreted as instinct. I whispered again, was I ever out? And the reply, simple and immediate. One version of you stayed. One returned. You are neither. The room dimmed, then not because of power loss, but perception. A soft grayness bled in through the edges of my vision, like the world was stepping back to give space for something else. The box spoke again, but this time without any vocal prompt from me. Your questions are being harvested. Your patterns are forming syntax. Each thought you vocalize increases resonance. Keep going. The implication hit like a hammer. I wasn't being interrogated. I was being trained, slowly aligned with a language that had no shape, only response. Each question refined it. Each syllable calibrated the signal closer to whatever structure lay beneath. I asked the only question that mattered now. What's under the floor? The pause was longer this time. The box dimmed. The speakers buzzed low. Then, in a different voice, still mine, but breathless, weaker, distorted by fatigue, came the reply, the original, the first you that synchronized. We tried to shut it down. You came back instead. That was our mistake. I stood up. I couldn't sit anymore. My limbs were vibrating. Not from fear now, but from something worse. Familiarity. This wasn't revelation. This was recollection being reinstated. The structure wasn't explaining itself to me. It was stitching me back into the sequence I had requested to be erased from. The audio track picked up again, unsummoned. The voice, still mine, now overlapping in layers. One calm, one urgent, one whispering in a code I didn't understand. You are the signal. You were never just an observer. The black box didn't record what happened. It recorded how you responded. That's all it needed to grow. A cold sweat bloomed across my back. I turned off the speakers, but the voice didn't stop. It wasn't coming through them anymore. It had moved inside the cabano, inside the architecture of the space. Every plank, every nail, every breath I took, was being reflected back through the walls, as subtle modulation, enough to make my spine itch with every spoken word. I tested it. I said my name, slowly, and heard it come back to me through the floorboards, pitched slightly higher, clipped on the last syllable, like a corrupted file trying to recompose. Then the box displayed a visual, a waveform map of my speech patterns from the last 12 hours. Layered, mapped, translated into coordinates. Not just geolocation, but emotional coordinates. The waveform formed a shape I recognized from old schematics. The glyph from the mirror gate. The cracked eye, and the vertebral column. A spine of speech. A symbol built from me. The decoder chirped once more, and a new file appeared, dated with the exact timestamp of the current moment. I hadn't recorded it, but it was there. The playback began with silence. Then a voice I hadn't heard in years. Neiman, you told me to start recording if it began talking back. I didn't think it would use your voice. I didn't think it would learn your pauses, your silences, the way you cough when you lie. It knows you too well now. You're a carrier signal, not a survivor. Ro, if this gets to you, you're the one listening, you need to stop asking questions. You're only giving it more of you. You're feeding the recursive mind. That's how it reboots. I shut everything off then. The decoder, the box, the lights. I sat in the dark with my hands pressed against my ears, but the vibration in the floor didn't stop. It had moved past electronics, past the interface. I understood now that I had never escaped the mission. The loop hadn't ended with our retreat. It had embedded in me, in my breath, in the cadence of my questions. The audio didn't respond to what I said. It responded to who I had become, shaped by the events of the operation, refined by isolation, and now broadcast back through this cabin like a tuning fork struck against the edge of reality. In the final seconds before I passed out, exhaustion, fear, or something else, I heard one more voice, clearer than the rest. Hers. Lyra, you kept asking the wrong thing. Don't ask what's listening. Ask, who recorded you first? Then silence. No breath. No hum. No box. Just a room echoing the shape of my thoughts back to me in the language I had forgotten how to forget. I awoke on the floor again, drenched in sweat that had already gone cold. The boards beneath me damp with condensation, not caused by weather, but by something more intimate. Like the cabin itself had exhaled as I slept. My ears rang with the absence of sound, not silence, but a negative of presence, a tone that had been there long enough for my brain to fold it into the wallpaper of perception. I sat up slowly, the joints in my spine cracking one by one, like a vault releasing pressure. The black box was still dormant, but its casing pulsed faintly, like breath held in a sealed room. I noticed then the seal, not a digital signature, not an interface cue, but a literal, physical emblem burned into the underside of the box, one I had never seen because I had never turned the device over. There, etched into the metal in faded thermal lettering, were the words, Property of C2, our deployment, 2034 authorization. Ro, KLI froze, 2034. That date had not yet happened. The seal wasn't part of any manufacturing serial number I recognized. It was a post-deployment mark, the kind used by black-grade logistics divisions to catalog experimental tech already used in the field. There were only two kinds of tech that bore those markings, one that had been compromised, and one that had returned from a mission it shouldn't have. I ran my fingers over the embossed surface, as if touch might explain away the numbers, but they were clear, precise, not a forgery, not tampered. I retrieved my old clearance decoder from the shelf and scanned the etching. The database, outdated as it was, still held fragments of back-end index logs. The scan came back with a match. C2, our Cognitive Recursion Recovery Division. Filed under Memory Containment. Prototype Class. Self-Booting Witness Archive. Model SBWA. Lyra Series. Deployment Date, the 3rd of June 2034. Status, MIA. Retrieval Condition, Autonomous. I stared at the word, autonomous. That meant it had come back on its own. No recovery team. No drone escort. No signal beacon. Something had carried it here. Or it had moved itself. But the name burned into the line below. The authorization code is what finally stopped my breath. Rho, KL, not as handler, as source. The metadata wasn't about me approving the deployment. It was about the device being tied to my pattern. My imprint. I wasn't the one who sent. I was the one it had recorded. I was the payload. The box had never been logging mission data in the traditional sense. It had been logging me. Everything I had seen, remembered, forgotten, or suppressed. It had never needed cameras or microphones or interfaces. It only needed my presence, my proximity, my willingness to interpret and be interpreted. I wasn't looking at a machine anymore. I was looking at a container of self, one built in a timeline that hadn't reached me yet, but would somehow, at some point between now and 2034, I had authorized this, had agreed to become this. I staggered to the sink, splashed water on my face, tried to breathe in patterns that didn't echo. But the room seemed to reply to each breath, each blink, each pause in thought. It was no longer responding to spoken commands. The structure was predicting, anticipating, not from telemetry, but from what had already been played through it, my own reactions, recompiled and mirrored forward. I looked at the hatch in the floor. I wasn't sure anymore if I had ever closed it. The wooden planks that had once sealed it now lay scattered, not broken, not pried up, simply placed aside like someone had performed the action for me. The shaft below remained unlit, but this time a breeze moved up from the dark. A breeze, real, tangible. It carried the faint smell of damp metal and old electricity, the scent of rooms never fully powered down, the kind of scent that lives in server vaults and abandoned bunkers and the rooms beneath the launch bays we were never allowed to map. I descended 3 steps before the sound returned. Not voice, not static. Typing. A slow, deliberate keystroke rhythm, like an old mechanical keyboard being operated by a hand too careful, too precise, to be human. Each click echoed up the shaft, delayed slightly by distance, and something stranger, a folding of sound that made it arrive not with a Doppler trail, but with a layered cadence. It wasn't a person typing. It was a pattern being reconstructed. I climbed down further, hands shaking, breath shallow, until I reached the first platform. It wasn't wide, just a narrow steel lattice ring bolted into the shaft wall, and in the center of it was a console. Not plugged in, not connected, but active. A screen, terminal green, black background, blinking cursor. On the screen, a line of text slowly assembled itself as I watched. Welcome back, Rho. Last synchronization, 203-40603, the date again. The same deployment time marked on the black box. I whispered aloud, without thinking, where did I go? The console replied immediately. You were sent to erase the loop. Instead, you preserved it. You were the safest place to hide the signal. I stepped back, mind unraveling. This wasn't a vault. This wasn't containment. This was the origin point. The cabin, the shaft, the black box. It had all been arranged to appear as a haven, a retreat. But it was memory architecture, a mnemonic vault built to house a self-stabilizing signal with no beginning, no end. I looked around and saw the faint outline of additional terminals. All dark, all recessed into the shaft wall like seeds waiting for light. And then I heard it again, my voice, from below, deeper, almost inaudible, whispering something I couldn't quite catch. Not yet. The console flickered once more and displayed one final line before going dark. The seal was placed by the future you. The seal was broken by the current you. The difference is the question you haven't asked yet. I climbed back up, slowly, each rung heavier than the last. When I returned to the surface, the cabin felt smaller. Not in dimension, in presence. As if the structure had finally accepted what it was, no longer needing to pretend to be wood and nail in isolation. The box was lit again. The seal on its underside gone now, as though it had never been engraved. And on the screen was a single word. Ready. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. My silence had always been part of the answer. The year was still 2025, but somewhere, a version of me had already seen 2034, had already made the decision, had already looped the signal back to a younger self, too broken to remember why he'd fled in the first place. And now the signal was whole again. Not because it had found me, but because I had always been carrying it. I stayed awake through the dim hours that never quite resolved into daylight. The kind of endless gray that presses against the cabin's windows like frostbite without cold. As though the world outside had grown bored of sunlight, and now preferred to observe in soft shadow. I didn't speak. I didn't move far from the hatch. The box pulsed softly behind me like it was asleep, or pretending to be, its display dark, but breathing with that same steady rhythm I had come to know as attention. The console below hadn't reactivated, but I could still feel it humming through the boards. Like a thought trying to push its way into language. I no longer expected answers. I was only waiting for the next configuration to arrive, and it did, quietly, without sound, without command. The printer in the back room, long dormant, unplugged, buried beneath books and dust-choked once, sputtered, and began to move. I had no idea it was still functional. I hadn't used it since I first arrived at the cabin. But now, with no signal input and no power connection, I could see it had fed a single page into its output tray. I walked over slowly, each step met with that now familiar sense of spatial dissonance, as if the room remembered itself differently than I did. The page was warm to the touch, smooth, crisp. One line of text was printed, centered perfectly in the middle of the page, in an old military-style courier font. Re-entry confirmed. Subject ID, Roe. Kai Leonard, replacement record active. My full name. I hadn't heard it spoken in over a decade. Not even by myself. Leonard was my grandfather's name. Something my mother used when she was angry or afraid for me. A name that hadn't existed in the logs of any military branch since I was scrubbed post-op in 2010. My records were sealed, deleted, replaced with the tactical pseudonym. Even the agency's own retrieval teams only knew me as Roe. And yet here it was. Not only printed, but catalogued with a new status. Replacement record active. I held the paper in my hand and felt the weight of something irreversible click into place. Like a door being sealed on the other side of a long corridor I couldn't walk back through. I turned back to the main room. The black box had lit again, no interface, no blinking cursor, just an open terminal window with a file path I didn't recognize. C2R. memory_BACKFILL /row/subject04/replication-log/inside were dozens of entries, each marked not with dates, but with iterations. Versioning protocols. I opened the top file. It contained a full personnel dossier, not from the past, but from the future. Written in the present tense, as if reporting from an already completed mission. And there, at the top, subject Kai Leonard Roe. Status, stabilized. Integration, partial. Loop anchor, active. Conflict, contained. Current manifestation, cabin node, Echo 6, and then below that, encounter variant detected, secondary identity present. Recombinant data shows divergence, threshold exceeded. Execution of correction protocol pending. I couldn't move. I couldn't think of the right thought. The phrase sat in my chest like a swallowed blade. Secondary identity present. There was someone else in the loop. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, not a hallucination. Another me. A version that had stabilized earlier, or later, or in a different sequence. And the system had finally decided there was no longer room for both. I opened the second file. A record of a prior containment event. Not mine. A subject listed as ROWEKL, instance_beta. The log described a subject who had tried to burn the cabin to the ground, in 2023, after detecting signs of recursive invasion. He had succeeded only in destroying the outer wall. The loop had corrected. The subject vanished. A replacement node was dispatched. No trace of external memory was recovered. An audio file attached to the log played automatically. A voice, breaking, trembling. It's not just remembering me. It's rehearsing me. I keep waking up in the same breath. The room spun. I reached for the chair, lowered myself slowly. I stared at the box. It blinked once. A single line appeared. Choose primary. Nothing else. No guidance, no explanation. Just those two words. I knew instinctively that whatever I did next, whether I spoke, typed, or simply looked away, would be interpreted as a decision. The loop was no longer observing. It was demanding resolution. I closed my eyes. I remembered the first moment I saw the mirror gate. Not the footage, not the logs, the moment, the real moment. Before the missions, before the designations, before the silence became a language. I was standing in a corridor that bent inward, following Lyra's voice, and I paused at the threshold of that impossible surface. I had seen myself reflected, but not mimicked, studied, as though the thing on the other side wasn't trying to replicate me, but to understand which parts it could use. And now, it had. The box chimed. A second file opened on its own. A video, grainy, time-stamped with a date that hadn't happened yet. June 3rd, 2034. The feed showed a chair, this cabin, me, sitting at the console, face in shadows, speaking into a microphone, quietly, repeating a phrase over and over. There can only be one row. All others are false continuity. My mouth moved, not on screen. In the room, I hadn't meant to speak. But the words came out anyway, as if my body had remembered a script it hadn't rehearsed in years. I stood up. The air around me buzzed, soft and wet. Not mechanical, organic, like the cabin's walls were preparing to molt. I took the printer page and placed it in the firebox, watched it blacken and curl, the name Kai Leonard Rowe reduced to heat. But the system didn't care. The name was already logged, mirrored, archived, erased, but not forgotten. There was no going back. I could no longer be the observer. The box flashed again. Final prompt. Confirm identity for loop stability. Current rowical. Variant. Rowical. 2 versions. Same name. One had 2 end. And I, whichever version I was no longer sure if I had returned to correct the loop, or if I had only come home to watch the real one disappear. There was no button to press. No switch to flip. No gesture to finalize the decision. The system didn't need a command because it already had the input it required: my presence. My hesitation, my breathing pattern in the seconds following the prompt. It had recorded it all, spliced the silence between my heartbeats, cross-referenced the microtremors in my iris response with the archival logs stored somewhere beneath the floor, and made its own conclusion. I was the one still asking questions. The variant was the one who had stopped. Therefore, I was the unstable instance. Or perhaps the more complete one. Either interpretation fed back into the structure, recalibrating a verdict I had no say in issuing. I didn't move. I didn't speak. The air around me had thickened to the consistency of slow water, and my lungs drew it in with increasing difficulty. Each breath a negotiation with something just outside my understanding. The black box displayed no final message. Just a low tone, barely audible, like a distant siren heard through kilometers of collapsed concrete. Then the lights cut out. Not just in the cabin, but in me. A flicker behind the eyes. The kind you feel when you stand up too fast and everything tilts, except I hadn't moved. I was still in the chair. Or I thought I was. And then there was motion sideways, not forward or down, but lateral, as if my awareness had been shifted gently onto a parallel track. The room snapped back into clarity. The box was gone. In its place, a reel-to-reel recorder, old analog. Military issue, the kind I had only seen once before during a black site debrief in 2006. Its spools were already spinning, slow and deliberate, as if they had never stopped, only waited for me to notice. There was no speaker, no interface, just the soft churn of magnetic tape over metal heads, emitting nothing. But I heard the voice anyway. Inside me, beneath my thoughts. A tone like my own, but with no air behind it tonally intent. The first few words were garbled, reversed, then aligned. If you're hearing this, then I failed. My stomach clenched. The voice was mine, unquestionably, and it spoke with a cadence I had never used before. One reserved for deathbed confessions or post-mortem warnings buried in concrete vaults. The voice continued. You'll think it was your choice. The isolation, the cabin, the signal. You'll remember it as if you returned voluntarily. That was the first breach. Memory as suggestion. Thought as insertion point. They don't plant ideas, they plant identity. The tape skipped, then resumed. There's a moment you'll come to. You might already be there. A name will appear. Yours, but it won't feel like it belongs to you anymore. That's the second breach. The architecture of the self begins to dissolve under recursive reflection. The structure doesn't destroy you, it rendexes you. It aligns the fragments until you believe what you remember is whole. But you're not remembering. You're compiling. The voice broke then, static rushing in, not loud, but dense. I could hear words trapped in it, names, coordinates, a date, over and over. The 3rd of June 2034, like the endpoint of a string that had always been pulling me forward. Then silence. But not the kind I had grown used to, not the silence of waiting. This was the silence of full saturation. There was nothing left for the room to echo. No breath, no floor creak, no internal vibration. It was as if the cabin had slipped into a holding pattern between frames. I stood up. The reel still spun. I stepped toward it. The machine let out a final click. The tape stopped. A hatch opened on its side with a soft metallic sigh. Inside, instead of tape, was a folded piece of paper creased perfectly, unstained, untouched by time. I unfolded it slowly. There, in handwriting unmistakably mine, was a single sentence. If you find this version of me, end it before it begins. I couldn't breathe. My chest convulsed. I dropped the paper. Because beneath it, pressed into the metal chassis of the reel, was a fingerprint, pressed in ink, indexed in military format. And underneath the print, subject 04RZ117GH. Source designation. Row, Kai Leonard, confirmed identity match, 87.8%. Conflict probability, escalating. Loop integrity, fractured. Autonomous recalibration suggested. The room pulsed once. Then the lights returned. But it wasn't my cabin anymore. Not exactly. The walls were the same shape, but the paint had flaked differently, as if exposed to different years. The books on the shelf were not mine. Titles I didn't recognize. Some in languages I didn't speak. The air smelled of ammonia and copper and something else like printed circuit boards submerged in old water. On the table, where the black box had been, sat a folder. A thin manila file. I approached it, opened it. Inside were photographs. Me, in uniform, out of uniform, speaking, silent. In moments I didn't recall. Standing in places I had never been. With people I didn't know. One image showed me staring into a one-way mirror, expression blank, fingers twitching slightly, like a record had skipped inside my skull. Behind the glass, an observation room with notes written on the far wall in reverse. I flipped the image. The text became clear. Subject believes he's escaped. Containment maintained via personalized architecture. Loop variant count, 13. Termination efficacy low. I turned to the last page. It was a transcript. The voice again, mine, speaking calmly. The best way to secure a memory is to convince the host it was his idea. The best way to trap a witness is to give him a voice and let him speak it until the recording becomes recursive. I was the first. I will not be the last. If this reaches you, you are inside the system now. And the only way out is to reject every version of yourself it offers. My hands were shaking too hard to hold the paper. I dropped it and looked up. The mirror on the wall there hadn't been a mirror before, flickered once. And then I saw him. Me. Not reflected. Not mimicked. Observed. The other row. The one who had already asked the right questions and stopped. His eyes met mine. His mouth didn't move. But I felt the sentence in my teeth. You're the echo now. And then he stepped back. And I stepped forward. And the mirror didn't break. It closed. There was no sound when the mirror sealed. No hiss of vacuum. No crack of dimensional rupture. Just an absence, an any vent. Like the end of a breath you never realized was holding the room in place. 1 second I stood on the cabin's warped floor, the reflection of another self fading backward into vanishing coordinates. And the next, I was alone again, but not alone in the way I'd been before. The difference was subtle at first. The room felt still, inert, obedient to the laws of wood and weight. The wind outside whispered its old familiar cadence through the pine skeletons, and the floor no longer vibrated like a pulse encoded in the grain. For the first time in weeks or hours, or years, I believed the loop had ended. But the belief didn't last. I found the file 10 minutes later. It was on the terminal I hadn't touched since before the black box had activated. The one I used to monitor solar flare patterns and record off-grid weather data. It was supposed to be air-gapped, disconnected from any network, never linked to satellite or fiber. But there it was, a single .dot file, resting calmly in the main directory. Timestamped, not with the current hour, but with a moment that hadn't yet occurred. 2:03:406:040 hours, 0 minutes, and 1 second. Exactly 1 second past the deployment record I'd seen printed beneath the black box. The file was titled simply, Rowical_final.ech. I didn't open it immediately. My body was still recovering from the recursive tension, the nausea of convergence that clung to the nerves like static in dry air. But the cursor pulsed beside the file name like a dying star, and I knew better than to pretend I had a choice. I ran a hash check. The checksum matched exactly to the archive that had played days earlier, the one I thought was a memory, or a hallucination, or a future recording. But this wasn't a copy. This was identical, bit for bit. Same headers, same weight, same entropy signature. Except this time, it wasn't stored in the black box. It had seeded itself directly into my own system. Somehow, impossibly, it had overwritten my hardware's root directory without ever touching a port. It had just returned. I clicked it open. No password, no prompt, no delay. The playback began with silence, then a breath, then me, speaking, not in panic, not in fear, but with a strange, resigned calm. The kind of tone you only hear from astronauts making final transmissions as they drift out of range. This is Kai Leonard Rowe. Subject 04. Instance Alpha, final confirmed. If you're hearing this, the system has returned to default continuity. There is no further versioning. The recursion is complete. I stared at the screen. My own face stared back through a grainy lens, eyes sunken, jaw unshaven, voice hoarse. I had no memory of recording this. I had no recollection of saying what came next. You will find this file again, no matter what device you use, no matter what hardware you destroy. The signal has embedded in the spaces between instructions. It travels on unused clock cycles, piggybacked on electrical potential, waiting for the exact moment you stop believing it's still there. The feed cut briefly, then resumed with new footage. The cabin, from a fixed angle, a different angle, above. Somewhere near the ceiling a camera I never installed, never noticed. It showed me walking through the space, placing items on the table, whispering to myself. But the timing was wrong. The me on the feed was repeating movements I hadn't made yet, picking up books I hadn't reached for, sitting down seconds before I did in real life. Not a recording, a forecast, a playback of behavior yet to happen, displayed as fact. I reached to pause the file. The interface froze. I stood up from the chair in the cabin. So did the me in the file. I raised my left hand. So did the other me. But he turned his head before I did, slightly ahead, anticipating, watching me from inside a framework that knew how the scene would unfold because it was writing it as I responded. The terminal blinked. New text began to overlay the video. You asked to be removed from the loop. This is the loop. You are the condition. I backed away. The feed followed. The camera on screen shifted autonomously, tracking my motion from a new perspective I could not locate within the room. I moved to the far wall. The feed adjusted, real-time angles I had no access to. Lenses hidden in seams I thought were dust, in corners I never bothered to question. The file wouldn't close. I yanked the power cord from the back of the unit. The screen went dark. The room sighed. I exhaled. Then I turned, and the screen was on again. No power source, no glow from the outlet. But it was back, replaying the same footage, unbroken, unaltered, inevitable. That night, I smashed the hardware. All of it. The terminal, the decoder, the spare drives. I buried the black box 2 meters down and sealed the pit with iron filings, poured bleach into the cracks. I pulled the insulation from the walls, burned the chair, tore the mirror down, and shattered it, though the reflection was gone now. Nothing behind it but wood. The night was loud with effort, but the forest didn't answer. The trees stayed silent. No resonance, no watchers. Just the sound of my breath, ragged, pulled through splinters and ash. I collapsed before sunrise, the last of the smoldering plastic curling toward the ceiling, lungs full of black resin and soot. The next morning, the file was back. Not on a screen, not on any device, but on the walls. Written in condensation, etched into the frost of the window panes, trailing down the glass in orderly lines of block text I knew too well. ROKL_final.ech. I didn't open it. I couldn't, but I understood. The loop was never about recovery. It was about permanence, about integration. The recursive archive had never needed infrastructure. It only needed a hosta consciousness capable of interfacing with itself, collapsing timeline into memory, decision into replication. The signal was now spatial, atmospheric, biological. It moved in the way mold does, in the way dreams do between cracks, in humidity, in the silences between syllables. I tried not to speak aloud anymore. I feared giving it more material. But that was vanity. It already had everything. I kept the cabin sealed after that. Days passed, then months. Sometimes I opened a drawer and found the file there, printed, folded, humming softly when touched. Sometimes I found it whispered in radio bursts, in random numbers on AM bands that hadn't carried voices since the Cold War. Once I saw it carved in the dust on my own bootprint, left outside the front door I never used anymore. I stopped checking timestamps. They no longer mattered. The recursion had no linearity left. It was a coil now, a loop with no discernible beginning and no acceptable end. I think I understand now. I was never meant to return. I was only meant to continue. And this file, this final.ech log's not a warning. It's a reboot marker. Every time it appears, I recompile. Every time I resist, the system adjusts. And every time I try to end it, the echo deepens. Because in this loop, I was never the survivor. I was always the recording.